Okay, hello everyone, I'm Naomi, and I'm going to talk to you today about how we might speculate about public space in Lancaster and the Internet of Things. And the first thing I guess I need to do for that is to talk about what I mean when I say the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is the idea that things in our environment, things in the physical space, are also digitally connected. So they might be collecting data, they might be sending it somewhere, they might be receiving data from either the environment or other objects or the internet, and using that to have some kind of reaction and response. So this is the idea that we have things like smart fridges, smart kettles in your home have been quite popularly spoken about. But in fact, what I'm talking about today is not things that you might buy as an individual and have in your home or in your office, but things that are in the public realm. So things in our cities which are collecting data about the environment, about how things are moving through the city, that might be put in place by public organisations or by companies or organisations that want to support the city and its people in its operation. But there's often things that we need to think about when these devices and objects and networks are coming into our cities. And there's often questions that need to be raised around the ethics of doing this, how it's put into place so it's doing good for people and not harming people. And a lot of that comes down to transparency, how people are made aware of what these things are actually doing. Even the fact that they're there in the first place can be sometimes not clear. An example of this is putting in some devices in the city of Chicago. And what happened was it was a really good project. It was between the city governance and a research project. And they said, we're going to make what we call a Fitbit for the city, the Chicago array of things. It's going to collect things like the noise levels, the pollution, the traffic movements, and really help us plan a better city. The problem was they started this project, they did some pilots, and then the press found out about it and wrote some articles saying, well, wait a minute, we didn't ask for this, we don't know what it's doing, we don't know what it's recording. Is it really collecting everything we say when we move past these lampposts where these devices are? And so the project had to be halted while they reconsidered both the policies around it and also actually what it was doing. So they changed the hardware. So instead of recording everything and sending it, it recorded and only sent the noise levels rather than the actual recordings. So we have to think about whether things are actually made visible. This bollard object that was put in place in Aberdeen, where I used to be, and the local people said, what's this? We don't know what it is. It's not a usual traffic bollard. It's just one. It's on the new road. We can see there's electricity going into it, but there's no sign, there's no information. So we have to think about how people actually understand these things. And what I was working on is some projects to really think about how people react to these objects collecting data and how we find out what these things are. So we need to ask questions like, who installed this device? What sensors does it have? What purpose is it actually serving? What's it there for? Is it collecting data? And if so, what data is that? Are there risks associated with that? Where does the data get sent? How is it used? And particularly, what control do I have over the data as a member of the public, as someone who might be affected by this? And that comes into questions of risks. And this is also for devices that might be installed without necessarily us thinking too much about it in our homes, like smart meters. So again, thinking about where the data is sent, how it's used, and again, what control do I have over it? So the project that I've been working on in Lancaster, I'm going to speak a bit about, is called PPITI, which stands for Participatory Policies for Internet of Things Ethics, thinking about the ethics of these kinds of deployments. And this was a project working with Lancaster City Council, working with some of my previous colleagues from Aberdeen, and funded by Petrus, which is the national hub for thinking about cybersecurity. And really, the focus of this project was thinking about the ethical use of Internet of Things in public spaces. So these kind of devices I was talking about, which are put in our public space. Thinking about questions of how are they governed, who is impacted, and how we're making policies around that. And that was what we were really interested in, helping the council develop these ethical policies. And do so in a way that is ethical. So what do we do to start this process? Well, what we did is arrange a walking workshop. We took members of the council on a walk around Lancaster to look at all the devices collecting data and giving them a field guide of Internet of Things in Lancaster. But the key thing is that not all of the devices that we walked around and talked about are actually ones that were real. We also used some fictional objects, things which didn't necessarily exist yet, but might potentially exist in future. Things such as smart lampposts, which are potentially proposed or exist in other places. Things like, for example, the bollard. It's in Aberdeen, it's not in Lancaster yet. So we equipped our bollard in Lancaster and said, what if this was collecting data? What do you think this does? And in fact, what we revealed to people, similarly to the one in Aberdeen, is what it's doing, these devices, is actually not so scary. What it's doing, it's collecting data on pedestrians and cyclists to help think about the movement of people through the city. The problem is, you can't tell that if there's no sign attached to it. Some of them were also a little bit further future, thinking more speculatively, thinking about what if things like data collection, AI is used to monitor the spaces, to think about things like ventilation and occupancy. We did these walks during the height of COVID, so we were thinking very much about public health. We talked about equipping smart bins that collected data on what is thrown away and alerting the council to when it needs to be emptied, thinking about how does this help efficiency. So all of these questions we were asking, but also the ethics of how do people feel and what happens to all this data if it's interconnected. As well as these walks around the city, we wanted to get some other people's with different expertise to think about these questions and help us think about how this can go into policy. So because it was COVID, we couldn't get lots of people who were experts in cybersecurity to Lancaster, so we built a virtual Lancaster in a space called Gather and took people on the same walk around that virtual space, asking the same questions about these deployments. So what was the outcome of our project? We found some really interesting research findings about how people understand these devices, how they see the risks, and also the benefits. And so these research findings were a very important part of our work. But also, we have continued this in doing public engagement. So using these kind of processes, these walks, to help people, the public, understand what it means to have these devices in the cities and raise that transparency. We're actually doing a public engagement walk tomorrow. People in the room here are welcome to attend if you would like to see some of these devices. And we also developed policy with the council. So we've created a draft policy which we hope is going to be incorporated actually into policies in Lancaster to say, well, if a device is going to be installed, have we thought about things like what data is collected? Have we thought about who has ownership of that? Are there signs to tell people what's actually happening with these devices? And have we thought about if there's data from different sets of devices, is that going to cause impacts on people? Air pollution, for example, might seem a fairly innocuous thing to collect. But if we're collecting data on air pollution in different areas of the city, is that going to, for example, cause people's house prices to be affected if there is information that there's poorer air quality in certain areas? So these are some of the things that need to be thought about when putting in these devices, to think about them from that starting point of ethical use of data and also security, thinking about how the data is protected. The final output from our project was to develop a tool that can actually help people who are deploying and implementing these systems to really think through some of these questions. So we call this the Trust Lens tool. It consists of a set of cards that include all of these questions that we were asking that came out of things people asked when they walked around the city, when they saw these devices and really interrogated what they mean. So this is available as a tool on a website that anyone can use, and we hope that organizations such as local councils, such as people designing and developing these technologies, can think through and say, well, wait a minute, do we need to collect that data in that way? Can we do it in a way actually that perhaps is more secure, that helps people more? So these are the kind of outputs that we've got, and we hope that going forward we can really, again, support the ethical use of this Internet of Things technology in public space, because while there are risks and challenges, it really can be beneficial for thinking about the future of our cities. Thank you very much.